The execution of Jigme Sonam. He had introduced himself as Petrov. No one had said aloud the name his mother had given him in decades, and sometimes when it crossed his mind, he wondered if he was misremembering it, like memories of early childhood, or dreams. He was around 70 and looked it. He had an American gut, and the hint of a Texas twang he had spent 2 years developing and several decades utilizing hadn't fully slipped off his Yaroslavlian tongue. His lips seemed to always be pulled very subtly into the cold grin of a man who had seen much, suffered much, sacrificed much, but, in the end, had been allowed to enjoy the fruit of his labor. It was a grin that explained its own earning. He spoke in English, since he did not know Tibetan or any form of Chinese, and they did not know Russian. Most of them understood English conversationally, but as he talked, a young woman on the other end of the table muttered translations to her stone-faced father, the oldest man in the room. "It's a simple process," Petrov said, his eyes darting momentarily to the Tibetan flag hanging on the wall at the back of the room. "More than anything, it requires patience, which I'm told you have as a people." The Tibetans were attentive, almost reverent. They could not win fairly, but that did not mean they deserved to lose. So they had found him. "The essential point is this," he said. "You are not going to win. You have tried and failed. You will continue to try and fail." The Tibetans jolted. Some of them started to protest, declaring their undying devotion to the cause, decrying the notion of an ever-occupied Tibet. Petrov held up a hand to silence them. "They are too big, too strong, too determined. They have more resources. They have more fighters. How do you win a war against an enemy that so outmatches you?" "Courage," a young man said proudly. The elderly Tibetan on the end of the table snapped at the boy in his own tongue. Petrov asked the translator, "What did he say?" "Courage is a virtue, not a strategy," the woman replied. Petrov met the old man's eye and nodded his respect. The man did not nod back, but looked Petrov in the eye coldly, waiting. "No," Petrov said. "You have to give up. Because the easiest enemy to beat," he waited a few moments after the translator finished this clause so that the elderly man would get the same pause for dramatic effect, "is the one who doesn't know he's still fighting." Petrov pulled out and lit a cigarette and put one boot up on the table, leaning back in his chair. "And the best way to keep that secret from your enemy is to make him think he's already won." 45 years later. Two soldiers open the door so Zhao Gui, chairman of the Central Military Commission, can step out of the vehicle. He walks to the arena. His secretary appears beside him. "Are the cameras ready?" he asks. "They are," she confirms. "No bag. I want the cameras close on his face when he's killed." She nods before carrying the order to the appropriate people. Today, Jigme Sonam, the leader of the last major sect of Tibetan rebels, will be put to death. His execution filmed and broadcast all over China. The army is in place in every major city, ready to quell any dissent from lingering Tibetans, mostly acts of self-immolation. But in truth, such protestations will be sparse. There aren't enough Tibetan separatists left to protest since the Great Unification 4 decades ago. Gui has the army in place because he knows the announcement he plans to make before the execution will spark a very different group to riot. This morning, the home of President Wu Yaowen was raided, his family and himself taken prisoner for sedition towards the Communist Party of China. Yaowen's recent comment regarding Gui himself, "We must ask if there is such a thing as too much loyalty," could not be tolerated. The notion of too much loyalty a dangerous thought to allow. Of course, Yaowen has his followers. He is a lifelong politician of a respected family. Gui, meanwhile, is of low stock, is in fact preparing for the execution of a man whose grandfather had been allied with Gui's own years ago, Tibetan fighters fighting for a free Tibet. Some of the old guard had always held this against Gui, a new popular face, challenging their previously unshakable grasp on power. They think him brash, extreme, perhaps even, though these are only said in whispers amongst closest friends, treacherous. But to some of the old guard, he's a rising star, strong, unwavering, devoted to the Chinese middle class, slightly brutal perhaps, but that's understandable for someone coming from his background. His familial ties would be more an issue, but when the Great Solidarity occurred and the Tibetan separatist movement surrendered or splintered, Gui's father had helped the authorities arrest hundreds of Tibetan separatists, including his own parents and brother, who were planning to sabotage a coal power plant outside Jining. This left Gui's father an orphan, but one with a modest social credit score. Over the course of a devoted young adulthood, that score continued to rise, and he married into a middle-class family, offering his son a chance in life. By the end of his life, he had achieved a social credit score enviable even by some prominent socialites in Beijing, and his son was now preparing to take the position of paramount leader, as soon as Yawen is executed. In this regard, Zhao Gui is useful to the old guard. Look what you can do when you follow the rules. See how your family can rise. This had been why they let him through the door. See what loyalty can do. Follow the party. See how you prosper. The Great Solidarity and subsequent purges forced what few separatists remained to go underground, including the grandfather of Jigme Sonam. An occasional demonstration, a flaming body once a year or so, but mostly the movement's popularity waned. At 18, Zhao Gui had joined the PLA and demonstrated tactical brilliance and efficient ruthlessness against China's enemies, including the occasional resurgence of the old rhetoric of Tibetan independence, which, year by year, shed its Buddhist pacifism. After the war in which Gui fought with distinction, when China was free to govern hegemonically, he was put in charge of the region of Tibet, the home of his ancestors, and declared a doctrine of zero tolerance. There would be no camps, there would be no trial. Any acts or words of sedition were punishable by death, since, ultimately, saying a word is an action, as Gui would argue, and claiming Tibetan independence is tantamount to killing for it, and the judgment would be carried out mere moments after its ruling. The movement for independence, already splintered and fading, was further squashed under the heel of one whose grandfather had once been so prominent in it. So the party continues to put on a united front, and no one admits what everyone knows: the party, and with it the public, is schismatical. 45 years before. For a moment, Petrov was back in Stalingrad, where, at 18 years old and trying to find food for his sick mother and younger sister, even as he saw breadless bakeries and meatless butcheries fail to feed a starving population, what tasted worse than the hardly anything everyone was eating was the truth that had slowly spread from Soviet to Soviet, comrade to comrade, empty-stomached patriot to empty-stomached patriot. The Americans have food. Every system, no matter which, is corruptible, he said, returning to the present and to the Tibetan separatists. What do you suppose corrupts a system best? There were glances between them as they worked through the silent social machinations that determined who would offer the first guess. After a few moments, a young man offered bribery. Petrov smiled. No, though bribes can be used. Blackmail, a woman said. He waved it off. Blackmail is bribery with the status quo. Fear? Of? Violence, the same person guessed. Risky. An attack can weaken a system, but it might be rebuilt stronger. Violence can be coupled with this strategy and has been before, but you must be especially careful with it. We will not succumb to violence, a young idealist said. Do as I say, Petrov replied, and most of the violence will be committed for you. What do you mean? The young man asked. A system is best corrupted, Petrov said, by itself. The Tibetans looked between each other, confused. Give a system too much of itself and watch it cannibalize. It takes decades. You might not live to see the system collapse, but it will happen. It is inevitable. How? Someone asked. How do we do this? Again, I tell you, admit defeat, Petrov said. Again the outburst, but Petrov's hand was faster this time. Tell them they have won, he continued. Watch them celebrate. Let them tear down your wall and put fragments of it in museums around the country as a symbol of victory. Suffer quietly the indignities they force on you. Listen patiently and smile and nod to the proclamations that they have reached the end of history. And while they celebrate, bow to them and start to play by their rules. He could see confusion in their faces, so he explained the story of my own country. How does this make us win? Someone asked. You need to ask a different question. How do you make them lose? The elderly gentleman at the other end of the table started to talk harshly. When he was done, the translator turned to Petrov. He thought you were the great mind that toppled the hegemony of the United States. He thought you'd have ways to do something similar to China to secure Tibetan independence. I know how to make a country hate itself, Petrov explained. That should be enough. 45 years later. Zhao Gui steps up to the podium. The arena is full of soldiers standing at attention. He raises his hand and gestures for them to sit, a simple action made horrifying by the unity with which they do it. Gui smiles and adjusts the microphone and takes a moment before speaking. Most of the citizens in the region of Tibet, he says, are grateful citizens of China. But for almost a century now, certain groups have resisted that relationship with their mother country. My father's family, I am still ashamed to admit, was once part of the same organization this prisoner's family was. He gestures to Jigme Sonam, who stands in the middle of the arena tied to a post, hands behind his back, in grubby prisoner's clothes. He lifts his head to look at Gui, and they stare into each other's eyes, their hatred for each other as apparent as their loyalties. After a moment, Gui continues. I asked my father once when I was very young if it was hard to turn in his family, his father, his mother, and his brother, for their illegal beliefs. He told me someone disloyal to the party is no family of mine. The soldiers stomped their feet at once, a thwack of 10,000 boots. It was Gui who, a few years ago, first thundered that failing to praise the party was no different than criticizing it. Silence was as dissenting as dissent. What followed, a wave of crackdowns and arrests on ambivalent citizens, restrictions on those with only average social credit scores, many of which scores further plummeted, for those who continued to not mention the virtue and goodness of the party often enough. There were then protests and violence and Tiananmen squares that also did not happen. Zhao Gui looks to his left where a line of marksmen stand, holding their rifles muzzle to the sky, butt to their palm. Those in Tibet who deny the party's authority, Gui continues, deny both the past and the future, both progress and prosperity. They wish not for the well-being of their fellow countrymen, but for their deaths. Another thwack. Hong Kong does not exist on any modern Chinese map. And as I stand here ready to execute a traitor, another man is starting his short road to justice today, Gui says. Wu Yaowen, former, he emphasizes the word subtly, president of the Chinese Communist Party, has been arrested for inspiring disloyalty to the party and for speaking against the wisdom of the party leaders. Thwack. Gui smiles to himself. He has the military, but he can feel the shockwave even here. The spines of the conservatives who have become the liberals just straightened in alertness. Their darling dethroned, worse, arrested. This Tibetan thug, once an oxymoron like so much else happening in the country, that they let through their doors, absorbing more powers, now solidifying himself as the paramount leader. There are some who think this is the sign of a country ripping at the seams, Gui knows, and they are right, he supposes. They make it so. He will learn that there is no such thing as too much party loyalty, Gui continues. But first, this prisoner in front of me here will finally acknowledge that all his treasonous hopes have failed. Sonam stares blankly. Gui looks to the soldiers. Ready your weapons. 45 years before. You change nothing. You add nothing. All you can do is accelerate the system to its logical end, Petrov explained. For us, America's great advantage would be its great weakness. It was free, and it was therefore unequal. Its history, like all history, was sordid. We sent people to leftist organizations, workers' unions, civil rights and feminist groups, artistic communities, and we started telling a story. America is evil. America is cruel. America's entire foundation is rotten. It is racist. It treats women and blacks and homosexuals unfairly. It cares only about the rich. And the important thing, Petrov raised a finger, this is all true, in part. We did not lie. We emphasized the right part of the truth until it became, to enough people, the entire truth. And then they did the work for us. The story went from the radicals to contrarian intellectuals to controversial but respected intellectuals to mainstream intellectuals to pseudo-intellectuals and then to the arts and the elementary schools and the activists. And group by group, classroom by classroom, they demoralized each other. Petrov had become more educated than most Americans about their own history so that he could help craft it. In his story, America was the monolith always standing in the way of moral progress. Martin Luther King was no longer American. He stood up to it. Those who fought to free the slaves, they were not American. Only the slaveholders were. America was not a country that had increasingly enfranchised its citizens. It was the opposition at every step along the way. It doesn't take as many as you'd think. You are merely the seed, he quickly corrected. Not even the seed. The seed, as I'm saying, is already planted. You are extra water and sunlight. And then they tend to the garden themselves once the thought has taken root. At the same time we did this, some of us went to the other side, stoked their fires. Look how much the other side hates its own. Look how disgusted they are, how ashamed they are of their own country. Look how they stomp out freedoms in the name of equality and fairness. Look how they only care about minorities while the majority suffer so much. Look how they care about immigrants over their own countrymen. Look how they deny individualism for collectivism, the mantra of the communists. And the country had drowned in liberal solipsism. The definitions of their own system and virtues became corrupt. Liberty to attain capital, or to drown in a plutocracy allowed by free markets. Liberty to free speech, or to suffer the hatred protected by free speech. Liberty to be beholden to no group, or to be an individual, alone, 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 powerless against engines too enormous to understand unless you join with us, whoever the us is. The whites, the blacks, the companies, the unions, the rich, the poor, the Republicans, the Democrats, the Christians, the atheists, the cultured, the hicks. Free to subsume your individuality to the group of your choosing. The system would not choose for you. You got them to fight each other, someone said. Petrov nodded. A nation of useful idiots. The system was overburdened by its own democracy, by its own freedom of expression, by its own liberty, and the factions that were allowed to form by their own Bill of Rights. What if they find out you're working to pull them apart? Petrov blinked and shrugged blandly. They did. The old man spoke. The translator translated for him. That was America, she said. It allowed dissent and freedom of expression. China does not. No, Petrov replied. China has its own system, but any system can be overloaded. If America's system was liberty and individuality, what is China's system? Control, someone said. Petrov nodded. Just so. Accept it and accelerate it. Surrender. Say Tibet is theirs. Your social credit scores will be low, but you adopt that system, and some of you make it your god. Strive to become the best Chinese citizens China has ever seen. Punish dissent at every corner. Some of you will have to be sacrificed for this, I'm afraid, knowingly or not. Not is probably better. And those of you climbing the ladder, spread the party gospel broadly. Use the system to leave more and more citizens dispossessed due to their insufficient love of the party and Xi Jinping or whomever takes his place. Flood the system with loyalty. And then, when the dispossessed have reached critical mass, those of you who have stayed true to your true cause have a new army of willing participants left behind by the monolith. But do not strike too soon. Wait until there is a schism, when some prominent party member is caught in a moral compromise, as is guaranteed by an unforgiving system, and one of your own stands perched, ready to take their place. He looked over the room as the Tibetans considered the gambit. Would they accept Chinese rule at last? A false peace, a false surrender. Was he the same whisper that had told the useful idiot Gorbachev to tear down the wall weeks before that stupid cowboy had said the same? 45 years later, the soldiers aimed their weapons at Jigme Sonam's hoodless face. Gui imagines the camera zooming in on it just as he had ordered, allowing China to see Sonam's every expression. Gui holds up a hand to the marksman. The tension hangs in the air. But then, wait, Gui says. They lower their weapons. He leans to the microphone. I would like to pull the trigger. Thwack. Gui steps off the podium and walks to the firing squad. A soldier, smiling proudly, hands him a rifle. Gui salutes the soldier and takes it, and steps in front of Sonam. 45 years before, the translator raised her hand. What is Russia's system? She asked. Petrov's head tilted slightly. What would be the downfall in Russia's system if it got too much of itself? Oh, my dear, Petrov replied, that time has come and long since passed. We are already, he searched for a word, downfallen. What was it then? She asked. Petrov smiled at her darkly, sadly, the echoes of ancestral tragedy on his lips and in his eyes, the ghosts of the Tsars and the Romanovs, of the soldiers at Stalingrad, of Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and Tolstoy, the Bolsheviks, the believers, the cynics. He looked at the snow line flag hanging on the wall at the back of the room, blue and red rays out of a golden sun underneath a torch and the two lions and the yin-yang. It earned you years in Chinese prison, this flag. They would have to burn every last one. Win, at any cost, he said to her. But if you cannot, make sure no one else can either. 45 years later, in front of the thousands in the arena and the millions watching around the country, Zhao Gui steps in front of the prisoner and raises the rifle he had just been given. No one considers he might miss. He had been an excellent shot in the military. In mere moments, China will see Sonam executed by one of its own leaders. Victory will be complete. Tibet, long ago surrendered, will finally, absolutely, unequivocally be China. Meanwhile, Wu Yaowen's followers are already clashing with military in cities across the country. Each side calls the other traitor, and who can know who is right? For years, scholars worldwide would debate what happened in the moment before Zhao Gui pulled the trigger. For months, as the violence erupted in skirmishes of brother against brother, party member against party member, China against China, as buildings burned and bodies bled and there were no Tibetans to celebrate, people on both sides of the conflict would point to this moment right before Sonam was executed as proof of their cause. It could have been a mote of dust, or the nervous tick of a man facing down the barrel of a gun, or it could have been a gesture of camaraderie. They could never ask, for the second after it happened, the crack of a gunshot reached the ears of Jigme Sonam moments after the bullet had already destroyed his capacity to hear it. Video of the event would be scoured, watched and rewound, analyzed, scrutinized, satirized, and opposing sides would see exactly what they wanted to see. Gui's base saw merely a twitch, and the desperate delusions of an old guard losing power, seeking anything to discredit the man who had just arrested their favorite champion. The old guard of the party saw at last the damning evidence of conspiracy and treason they had suspected all along. Yawin's supporters swore with absolute certainty as they replayed the video to each other, even after now President Gui had banned its rewatching, rewinding again and again to the moment before Sonam's brains blew out the back of his skull. They swore that Sonam looked into Gui's eyes. Gui, a sleeper cell, there was talk of foreign influence. Gui, a Tibetan, both men whose grandfathers, it must be remembered, had been unified, absolutely unified in an insurrectionist cause. Sonam, the last of these Tibetans, looked into the eyes of his supposed enemy, a man who had gained so much power in the party and so much love of the people with social credit scores bordering on the rabidly loyal, and who professed to hate Sonam with a passion only matched by love of his nation. But yet this prisoner, the old guard swore, he looked at the man who was about to execute him and who would later appoint to positions of power almost to a person descendants of so-called reformed Tibetan separatists. And you can see, if you look, you can see the smirk. Sonam smirked at him, right at him, in a friendly way, in mutual triumph. And look, here, look, right before the shot. Sonam is still smirking, and he looks right into Gui's eyes. Don't you see it? He looks right into Gui's eyes and winks. The elderly gentleman at the under end of the table started to talk harshly. When he was done, the translator turned to Petrov. He thought you were the great mind that toppled the... He thought you were the great mind... Shoot. The elderly gentleman at the under end... The elderly gentleman at the under end of the table started to talk harshly. When he was done, the translator turned to Petrov. He thought you were the great mind that toppled the hegemony. The great mind that toppled the hegemony. The elderly gentleman at the under end of the table started to talk harshly. When he was done, the translator turned to Petrov. He thought you were the great mind that toppled the hegemony. The elderly gentleman at the under end of... The elderly gentleman at the under end of... The elderly gentleman at the under end... God damn. The elderly gentleman at the under end... The elderly gentleman at the other end of the table started to talk harshly. When he was done, the translator turned to Petrov. He thought you were the great mind that toppled the hegemony. Hegemony. The elderly gentleman at the other end of the table started to talk harshly. When he was done, the translator turned to Petrov. He thought you were the great mind that toppled the hegemony. The elderly gentleman at the other end of the table started to talk harshly. When he was done, the translator turned to Petrov. He thought you were the great mind that toppled the hegemony. Hegemony. That toppled the hegemony. Hegemony. It's a weird word. The elderly gentleman at the other end of the table started to talk harshly. When he was done, the translator turned to Petrov. He thought you were the great mind that toppled the hegemony. God damn it. Hegemony. Hegemony? I don't even know how to pronounce it. The elderly